So in this segment, we're going to be discussing Boris Johnson is being a nuisance over the Prime Minister's Brexit deal, so the Northern Ireland tweaks. We did cover some of the Johnson stuff before, but I think this goes into a bit more detail as to what he is doing. So Sunak is on a collision course with Boris Johnson over Brexit, amid claims that the former Prime Minister could complicate the talks to thrash out a deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Senior Tories have accused Johnson of being, quote, a nuisance and, quote, mischievous by encouraging the DUP to resist the compromise. And, this isn't a deal, this is tweaks, so journalists are being weird in some of the phrasing they used. But what Johnson is doing should be a sackable offence, to be honest. Going behind the Prime Minister's back of your own party to undermine him, especially given the stakes in Northern Ireland. Doing this, it shows how much Johnson puts himself above everything. His reasoning behind this makes no sense, and we will discuss that in a few minutes. But, this isn't just, undermining a Prime Minister over minor things here. This is almost international affairs here when you think of the Northern Ireland Protocol, really. Johnson said privately that Sunak would get a substandard deal unless he progressed with the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, which Sunak has paused to get more leverage. And I think there might be a typo in that text. Johnson has argued that we need to keep the Northern Ireland Protocol bill in place to get a better deal with the EU. This is nonsense, and I'm going to keep repeating this in a few of my videos here. This is nonsense because we are only making progress on talks over the protocol because we gave the EU access to the live data. Bullying the EU has not worked. People can argue we're making progress thanks to the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. Truss introduced that bill back in June 2022. So you're saying the EU sat on their hands for almost, half a year before, quote, making concessions? Or would it make more sense that the UK giving the EU live access data back in January 2023 would progress the talks like they are now? Like, really dumb. What a dumb argument. What a dumb argument from this lot, that a bill that's been paused is helping us make more progress than from last year than actions that are happening now. The bill drawn up when Johnson was Prime Minister would give the UK the right to ignore EU rules, which Brussels regards as a breach of international law, which, that, again, the phrasing there from the journalist isn't right. That's not what it does. It allows us to repeal or sort of ignore bits of the protocol. It doesn't allow us to ignore bits of EU law. Instead, Sunak is trying to negotiate a democratic consent mechanism that would let the Assembly in Belfast reject new EU regulations. And, it's not clear what Sunak is specifically trying to do. That's one of the key problems I'm having, because if it's the case that he's trying to set it up so Northern Ireland can ignore bits of new bits of EU legislation, that wouldn't work because Northern Ireland is part of the EU single market for goods, which means they have to implement whatever the EU passes. They're right, it would be a breach of international law, this bill. That's why the EU are willing to rip up the trade and cooperation agreement over breaching the Northern Ireland Protocol. This consent mechanism won't really work because how would you give a non-member power over EU laws? Northern Ireland is part of the EU single market for goods. It has to follow the same base standards of all EU members for goods. Otherwise, you run into a situation where subpar goods will get into the single market. Norway is consulted on rule changes, but has no say over the rules. So I'm guessing this might happen with Northern Ireland. But the idea they would get a vote or a veto, I can't see that happening. After the talks with von der Leyen, the European Commission president, Sunak said, quote, there is a deal that could be done, end quote, but stressed that a final agreement is, quote, by no means done. End quote. He said he was working to fix the democratic deficit in the protocol, and that's something maybe they should have done from the jump. But, Johnson was just desperate to get the deal done so he could get Brexit done, win the election and then get us out of the EU. A friend who recently spoke to Johnson said, quote, his basic worry is that we took the powers in the bill and we are not using them. We haven't got as good a deal as we could have because we didn't stick with it, end quote. And let's remember that Johnson and Frost came up with and agreed this deal. So this idea by threatening to renege on parts of the protocol just shows you that this lot of charlatans that cannot be trusted. Agreeing a deal and then reneging on said deal to get a better deal is pirate behaviour. I love pirates, but it's not how you run a nation state. If we live by these rules, then we can't complain when China keeps getting more authoritarian in Hong Kong, for example. And let's not forget, this idea that the Northern Ireland Protocol bill would get us a better deal with the EU if we stick to it. That's nonsense, because there's no way to prove that unless we go down that road. And then you wouldn't know if Sunak could have got us a better agreement or, better tweaks to the deal. It makes no sense. These are mutual decisions here. We don't live in the multiverse. This is a view shared by the ERG, not the multiverse bit. It's about the protocol bill. the hardline Brexiteers who were furious Sunak put the legislation on ice. We should remember that Steve Baker said the ERG wing will implode the government if Sunak deviated away from the Northern Ireland Protocol bill and the path they were on under Johnson. I think they'll do it. There are stories of 100 Tories looking to rebel. Absolute madness. A senior government official confirmed that far from using the bill as leverage, Sunak's plan is to drop it altogether if he gets a deal. Quote, if we can find a way to satisfactorily resolve the issues with the protocol, then we wouldn't need the bill, unquote. And this is one of the demands from the EU, that the legislation is dropped, because even if the DUP go back to Stormont and the EU back down, right, if this bill is passed, a relevant minister can just suspend bits of the protocol unilaterally. And even if a minister does not do it, the uncertainty is an issue. The fear in the EU that any minister could just start repealing bits of the protocol unilaterally if this bill gets passed. This legislation needs to go regardless. You don't bully trade partners like this. You don't bully other blocs or other nation states like this. It doesn't work. Senior government figures point out the problems Sunak is wrestling with were caused by Johnson's deal with Brussels in December 2020. They were still wary that Johnson might seek to undermine the negotiations and plot a return to number 10. Quote, Boris is being a bloody nuisance, winding up the DUP, a government official said. Quote, he is causing mischief. And that's absolutely true. Johnson, this all stems from Johnson lying about the protocol. That's what a lot of these problems come from. I don't think Johnson will come back. He's making a lot of money on the speech circuit. I think he's going to argue that when I was in charge, things were better. The ones that followed tanked the economy and the country. I think Johnson will play the kingmaker role, and when he writes his memoirs, when he writes a book about it, he'll talk about how he took control of the Tory party and how he got a successor in that, that they wanted, that he played the kingmaker role. In an effort to satisfy the DUP, Sunak is trying to negotiate so the EU would have to consult with the Assembly before regulations were imposed on the province, and we'll talk about that later on. I can see a discussion similar to what Norway have, similar to how the EU consults Norway, but nothing more than that. A Whitehall source said there is a decision paper for the cabinet ready to go. The statutory instruments are written. There is a dear colleagues letter that has been written for MPs. End quote. And it looks like for the most part the agreement with the EU is done. Sunak is trying to figure out how to convince his cabinet and the DUP before going to the broader Tory party. Maybe he can get some final tweaks with the EU after that, but it's not looking good for Sunak. The era of the short king may be over. We had Macron, Sunak and Zelensky, and now we might have only 2 short kings in Europe. Sad times. And you've got Marina Perkis talking about this situation, saying Sunak might scrap the Northern Ireland Protocol bill to reach a deal with the EU, but Johnson is already causing problems, saying, quote, it's a very good bill, it fixes all the problems. I'd go with that one. As ellipses, I'd go with that one. And so what Johnson is going to tell the DUP is, if you wait this out and the bill passes, we will get a better deal for the people of Northern Ireland than the one Sunak's going to get. That's what the DUP and the ERG are going to argue, and I think the DUP aren't going to go back to Stormont. There's lots of reasons why. I think the fact that they are the second party really hurts them. That Sinn Féin are, the senior First Minister effectively, and the DUP have been relegated to Deputy First Minister. I don't think they like that. More importantly, I don't think they're going to be fans of the consent vote that's going to happen next year on the protocol, which just requires a straight majority, not cross-community consent. I think that's what they're also trying to avoid here, but I just can't see them going back to Stormont, I'll be honest. And it terrifies me that that's going to happen, because that's what's going to trigger everything else to happen, such as an ERG rebellion. And I don't think Sunak's got it in him to face down the DUP, face down the ERG and the DUP. I really don't. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I know we covered some of this stuff a bit before, but I think this article goes into a bit more detail about the specifics of what Johnson is doing. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.